He's just a pizza boy at Domino's. My wife, the CEO, told her rich business partners. My wife's sister smirked. So disgusting. I smiled silently. The TV in the room began. Meet the world's newest billion-dollar CEO. Look, I'm not saying Tuesdays are cursed, but if they were, this particular Tuesday would have been the poster child for demonic possession. There I was, sitting in my home office that Clara insists on calling my man cave. Even though it contains 0 beer fridges and approximately 17 monitors that make the place look like NASA's control room had a baby with a Best Buy. I was 3 Red Bulls deep into debugging a piece of code that could potentially save my company somewhere in the ballpark of $4 to $7 million in cloud storage costs annually, which is the kind of money that makes accountants weep tears of pure joy. The algorithm was being a little drama queen, throwing errors like confetti at a parade, and I was this close to figuring out why when my phone decided to ruin my life. Not the gentle buzz of a text message or the polite chime of an email. No, this was the full-blown, obnoxious ringtone that I'd assigned to exactly one person in my contacts list, the same person who made me want to change my identity and move to a country without cell service. Malcolm Price, father-in-law, CEO of some empire that probably made its fortune back when people thought the internet was a fad and going viral meant you needed antibiotics. The man wore suits that cost more than most people's cars and had the kind of handshake that felt like a business transaction even when he was just saying hello at Thanksgiving. I stared at my phone like it was a live grenade, watching his name flash across the screen with all the enthusiasm of someone being told they won a free root canal. My finger hovered over the decline button, that beautiful red circle of freedom. But then I remembered that Clara had specifically asked me to be more receptive to her father's attempts at bonding, which apparently translated to answer the phone when he calls or sleep on the couch for a week. With the kind of resigned sigh usually reserved for people about to sit through a 3-hour meeting that could have been an email, I answered, "Hey, Malcolm, what's up?" Evan's son. His voice boomed through the speaker with the confidence of a man who'd never been told no in his entire life. I could practically hear the mahogany desk and leather chair through the phone. "Hope I'm not catching you at a bad time. Were you at work?" I glanced at my 17 monitors, the half-empty energy drink cans scattered across my desk like aluminum casualties of war, and the code that was currently mocking me with its refusal to cooperate. "Yeah, actually, I'm in the middle of something pretty important." "Excellent. Excellent," he said, completely ignoring the implied request to make this quick. "Listen, I'm hosting a private dinner this Friday evening at the Monarch. Very exclusive, very intimate. Just a few colleagues of mine, real heavyweights in the business world. I thought it might be beneficial for you to meet them. Network a little, you know? Make some connections with actual businessmen." He paused, and I could hear the condescension dripping through the phone like honey laced with arsenic. "Who knows? Maybe one of them could help you land a better position. Something with more stability, more prestige, a better job." There it was, those 3 little words that rich people love to throw around when they fundamentally don't understand what you do for a living, or more accurately, when they've decided that what you do isn't impressive enough by their country club standards. It's the verbal equivalent of patting someone on the head and saying, "That's nice, dear," while mentally calculating how much of a disappointment they are. I could have explained, right then and there, exactly what my company did. I could have told him about SliceNet systems, about the algorithms that were revolutionizing logistics for some of the biggest names in retail and delivery. I could have mentioned the contracts, the valuation, the fact that my position was founder and CEO of a company that was about to hit unicorn status harder than a truck full of glitter hitting a brick wall. But where's the fun in that? "That's really thoughtful of you, Malcolm," I said, injecting just enough fake gratitude into my voice to sound sincere without actually meaning it. "I'll have to check with Clara, but Friday should work." "Fantastic. 7 o'clock sharp. Dress code is business formal, naturally. See you then, son." He hung up before I could respond, which was probably for the best because I was about to tell him that I owned exactly one suit, and it was purchased for our wedding 4 years ago and hadn't seen daylight since. I set the phone down and stared at my code, but the motivation to fix it had evaporated faster than my patience for small talk at family gatherings. Malcolm Price, in all his infinite wisdom and decade-old business philosophy, thought I needed career help. The irony was so thick you could cut it with a knife and serve it as an appetizer at his precious dinner party. When Clara got home that evening, I was still in my office, though I'd made some progress on the storage issue and was feeling marginally less homicidal. She appeared in the doorway looking like she'd had the kind of day that required wine and comfortable pants, which meant she'd been dealing with her interior design clients who apparently thought reasonable budget meant infinite money. "Your dad called," I said, spinning my chair around to face her. "Invited us to dinner Friday night at the Monarch. Some kind of networking thing with his business buddies." I watched her face carefully, and let me tell you, the transformation was something to behold. Her expression went from tired to tense to that special kind of anxiety that only comes from knowing your two worlds are about to collide like galaxies in a really awkward documentary. She looked like she'd just tasted milk that was exactly 1 day past its expiration date. Not quite bad enough to spit out, but definitely questionable. "Oh God," she muttered, running a hand through her hair. "Evan, please. Please just be nice. Don't be difficult. Don't argue with him or his friends. And whatever you do, please don't mention your—" She paused, searching for the right words and settling on the worst possible ones. "Your pizza job. My pizza job. Right." That delightful little nickname that her entire family had bestowed upon my billion-dollar tech company, because the easiest way for their small minds to categorize what I did was to focus on our biggest client's product rather than the revolutionary logistics technology that made delivering that product possible. Never mind that we also worked with Amazon, Walmart, FedEx, and about 40 other companies that would make Malcolm's portfolio look like a lemonade stand. Nope, I was the pizza guy. The delivery boy who somehow convinced Clara to marry him despite being so clearly beneath her family's standards. "Sure, honey," I said, giving her my best reassuring smile. "I'll be on my absolute best behavior. Scout's honor." She narrowed her eyes at me, because she'd been married to me long enough to know that best behavior was a relative term and my version of it usually involved some degree of calculated chaos. But she was tired, and I could see her convincing herself that maybe, just maybe, this dinner would go smoothly. I agreed to go for 2 reasons, and I'm nothing if not honest about my motivations. First, because I genuinely loved my wife, even when her family made me want to fake my own death and start a new life as a sheep farmer in New Zealand. And second, because I have this character flaw where I absolutely cannot resist watching arrogant, pompous people dig their own graves with silver spoons while assuming everyone around them is holding plastic forks. Friday was going to be interesting. I could feel it in my bones, the same way you can feel a storm coming before the first drop of rain falls. Malcolm Price and his country club cronies were about to get a lesson in assumptions, and I was going to have a front row seat to the most entertaining show in town. Some people go to dinner to eat. I was going to watch the universe serve up a 5-course meal of humble pie, and honestly, I couldn't wait to see who'd be choking on it first. Friday arrived with all the enthusiasm of a sequel nobody asked for. You know, like when Hollywood decides that one mediocre movie deserves 17 follow-ups and a spin-off series. I woke up that morning with a sense of impending doom that felt a lot like the time I accidentally deleted 3 months of code before remembering that backups existed. Except this time, there was no undo button, no safety net. Just me and a dinner reservation at the kind of restaurant where they probably charge you $50 for looking at the menu wrong. Clara had been stress cleaning the house since dawn, which is her go-to coping mechanism when she's anxious about literally anything. I'd learned early in our marriage that when she starts reorganizing closets that were already perfectly organized, something big is happening. By the time I stumbled into the kitchen for my morning coffee. Okay, fine. My morning energy drink because I'm a heathen who doesn't understand the sophisticated appeal of artisanal pour-over coffee. She'd already rearranged the living room furniture twice and was eyeing the kitchen cabinets like they'd personally offended her. "It's just dinner," I reminded her, watching as she adjusted a throw pillow for the 3rd time in as many minutes. "We eat food, make small talk, and then we leave. Simple." She shot me a look that could have melted steel. "It's not just dinner, Evan. It's dinner with my father and his entire professional circle. These are important people, influential people, people who could—" She stopped herself, but I knew where that sentence was going. "People who could help your pathetic career if you weren't such a stubborn idiot about everything." The real fun started around 5:30 when Clara emerged from our bedroom looking like she'd stepped out of a fashion magazine. The kind of magazine where everyone looks effortlessly perfect and probably doesn't sweat or have bad hair days. She was wearing this midnight blue designer dress that probably cost more than my first car, the kind of outfit that screamed, "I belong at fancy restaurants where they describe food using words like deconstructed and essence of." Her hair was perfect, her makeup was flawless, and she looked every inch the daughter of Malcolm Price, successful CEO and professional disappointer of son-in-laws. Then she looked at me, and her face fell faster than the stock market during a recession. I was standing in the middle of our bedroom wearing black jeans, the nice ones without holes. Thank you very much. My cleanest pair of sneakers and my lucky hoodie. The same lucky hoodie I'd worn to my first major investor meeting, my first successful product launch, and pretty much every important moment of my professional life. It was comfortable, it was broken in, and most importantly, it was me. The hoodie was charcoal gray, made from that fancy technical fabric that cost way too much but felt like wearing a cloud, and it had exactly zero logos or branding because I'm not a walking billboard. Clara made a sound somewhere between a groan and a whimper, like a tire slowly deflating. Evan, no, absolutely not. You cannot wear that. I can, and I will, I replied, grabbing my watch, the one actually expensive thing I owned, a gift from my CTO after our Series B funding, and fastening it around my wrist. I'm a billionaire, not Batman. I don't need to dress up in a costume to prove who I am. You're not. She stopped herself, and I watched the internal struggle play out across her face. See, here's the thing. Clara knew what my company was worth. She'd seen the contracts, the bank statements, the term sheets from investors. But somewhere in her mind, there was this disconnect between the theoretical money and the reality of it, like knowing intellectually that space is infinite, but not really being able to comprehend what that means. My father expects business formal. That means a suit, Evan, or at least slacks and a dress shirt. Your father expects a lot of things, I said, keeping my tone light even though we both knew this was about more than just clothes. He expects me to be someone I'm not. He expects me to apologize for being successful in a way he doesn't understand. He expects me to show up and grovel for his approval while he and his buddies pat me on the head like a good little disappointment. I walked over to her, took her hands, and softened my voice. Clara, I love you. I'm doing this dinner for you. But I'm not changing who I am to make your dad feel more comfortable with his outdated worldview. She bit her lip, which meant she was stuck between agreeing with me and desperately wanting to keep the peace. Finally, she sighed. Fine, but if he says anything, I'm blaming you. Deal, I said, kissing her forehead. I accept full responsibility for my fashion crimes. The drive to the Monarch Steakhouse was tense in that special way where nobody's actually saying anything, but the silence is so loud it might as well be screaming. Clara kept checking her phone, probably fielding texts from her mother or sister about arrival times and seating arrangements. I focused on driving and mentally preparing myself for an evening of judgment disguised as polite conversation. The Monarch was exactly the kind of place I expected, all valet parking and marble columns, and a doorman who looked like he could bench press a Buick while reciting the wine list from memory. The building practically radiated exclusivity, from the subtle brass accents to the way the lighting seemed specifically designed to make everyone look rich and important. This was the kind of restaurant where they didn't list prices on the menu because if you had to ask, you couldn't afford it, and the waitstaff spoke in hushed, reverent tones like they were discussing classified government secrets instead of taking your order for overpriced steak. We handed the keys to the valet, a kid who looked at my 10-year-old Audi like it was a relic from a museum, and made our way to the entrance. I could feel Clara tensing up next to me with each step, her grip on my arm getting tighter like she was physically trying to hold herself together through sheer willpower. Malcolm was waiting in the lobby, naturally, because the man probably showed up to things 45 minutes early just to establish dominance. He was holding court with another couple, both of them dressed like they were attending a state dinner at the White House, and when he saw us approaching, his face went through a journey of emotions that would have won him an Oscar if facial expressions were an Olympic sport. First came the smile, big, welcoming, the kind of smile you give when you're about to introduce your daughter and her husband to important people. Then came the pause, that split second where his brain processed what his eyes were seeing. And finally, the look, that beautiful, priceless expression of someone who'd just realized that their worst nightmare was unfolding in real time, and there was absolutely nothing they could do to stop it. His eyes traveled from my sneakers up to my jeans, lingered on my hoodie like it was personally offensive to him, and finally landed on my face. If looks could kill, I'd have been a pile of ashes on the monarch's probably very expensive imported marble floor. He looked at me the way someone might look at a person who showed up to a black tie wedding in a Borat mankini, shocked, horrified, and deeply, deeply disappointed. Evan, he managed, his voice strained like he was fighting every instinct to just turn around and pretend he didn't know me. I see you've chosen comfort over convention. Always, I replied cheerfully, extending my hand for a shake that he accepted with the enthusiasm of someone touching a dead fish. Thanks for the invitation, Malcolm. This place looks great. Very Marble Y. Before Malcolm could respond. And oh, you could see the lecture forming behind his eyes like storm clouds gathering. Clara's sister Vera materialized out of nowhere like a designer-dressed ninja. Vera was 2 years younger than Clara, worked in marketing at some firm that probably spent more on office plants than most people's annual salaries, and had never met a backhanded compliment she didn't immediately weaponize. She was holding a champagne flute like it was a prop in a movie about rich people being terrible, and her smile had that sharp edge that meant she'd spotted an opportunity to make someone feel small and was absolutely going to take it. Evan, she exclaimed, air kissing near both my cheeks without actually making contact, because God forbid she actually touched the help. So glad you could make it. Love the casual look. Very authentic. Her eyes sparkled with malicious glee. Still delivering pizzas? Do they let you keep the free toppings, or is that against company policy? The few other guests who'd gathered in the lobby, all of them looking like they'd raided the set of Succession for wardrobe ideas, turned to look at me with varying expressions of curiosity and poorly disguised pity. I could feel Clara's fingernails digging into my arm through the hoodie, sending me telepathic messages that probably translated to, "Please don't make a scene, please don't make a scene, please don't." I smiled at Vera, the kind of smile I reserved for people who thought they were clever, but were actually just predictable. Yeah, Vera, all my billions come with extra cheese. It's in the contract. The laughter that followed was nervous and uncertain, like nobody could quite tell if I was joking or having some kind of breakdown. Honestly, neither could I. Malcolm led us through the monarch like a general leading troops into battle. Except instead of soldiers, we were a ragtag group of overdressed socialites and one guy in a hoodie who was already mentally calculating how much therapy this evening was going to require. The restaurant's main dining area was impressive in that aggressively wealthy way. All dark wood paneling, crystal chandeliers that probably cost more than a semester at Harvard, and the kind of ambient lighting that made everyone look like they were starring in their own personal cologne commercial. We weaved past tables full of people who looked like they discussed stock portfolios over breakfast and had personal assistants for their personal assistants. The air smelled like money and aged beef, with a hint of cologne so expensive it probably came with its own insurance policy. Every waiter moved with the precision of a ballet dancer. Every surface gleamed like it had been polished by tiny perfectionists with OCD, and the whole place had this hushed, reverent atmosphere that made you feel like talking above a whisper would get you kicked out and blacklisted from ever eating at a nice restaurant again. Malcolm stopped at a heavy wooden door that looked like it belonged in a medieval castle, the kind of door that said important people only, without actually needing a sign. He pushed it open with the kind of flourish usually reserved for magicians revealing their final trick, and gestured for us to enter what I can only describe as a private dining room that had been decorated by someone who thought. Subtle was a foreign concept they didn't need to understand. The room was massive, way bigger than necessary for a dinner party, with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city skyline like we were gods looking down on mere mortals. The table was long enough to host a medieval feast, set with more silverware per person than I used in an entire month, and decorated with flower arrangements that probably cost more than most people's rent. Everything gleamed and sparkled and screamed, "We have money and we want you to know it," in the most aggressively tasteful way possible. But the real showstopper wasn't the decor, it was the people. The guests were already mingling with drinks in hand, and I swear to God, it looked like someone had gone to a factory that mass-produced wealthy executives and just ordered the deluxe package. Everyone had that same polished, manufactured look of success. Perfect teeth that were definitely veneers, watches that cost more than cars, and the kind of posture that came from years of private school education and knowing you were better than everyone else. The men wore suits that probably had their own zip codes, tailored so precisely they looked like they'd been painted on. The women wore dresses and jewelry that sparkled under the chandelier light like they were competing to see who could blind someone first. And every single person had that look. You know the one. That expression of confidence that came from never having been told no in any meaningful way, from growing up in a world where connections mattered more than competence and family names opened doors that talent couldn't even find. This was the ego factory, running at full capacity, and I just walked into it wearing sneakers. Malcolm cleared his throat with the kind of authority that demanded attention, and the room gradually quieted as people turned to see who the new arrivals were. I watched their eyes scan Clara first, approving nods, warm smiles, the kind of recognition that came from seeing someone who belonged in their world. Then their gazes shifted to me, and I could literally see the confusion spreading across their faces like a virus. It was beautiful, really, watching them try to reconcile the hoodie and jeans with the fact that I was standing next to Clara Price, Malcolm's daughter, in a private room at the Monarch. "Everyone," Malcolm announced, his voice carrying that tone of forced enthusiasm that parents use when introducing their kid's imaginary friend to other adults. "I'd like you to meet my daughter Clara and her husband, Evan." He paused, and I could see him weighing his options, trying to decide how to introduce me in a way that wouldn't completely embarrass him. He settled on what he probably thought was a safe middle ground, which meant it was absolutely going to be a disaster. "Evan works at Domino's, in their delivery operations." The silence that followed was so complete, so absolute, that I could hear someone's Rolex ticking from across the room. It was the kind of silence that comes right before something either explodes or implodes, and I wasn't entirely sure which was about to happen. People glanced at each other with those quick, darting looks that said, "Did he really just say Domino's?" while trying desperately to maintain their polite expressions. Then, because the universe has a truly twisted sense of humor, one guy stepped forward from the group. He was probably in his 60s, with silver hair that looked like it had never experienced a bad hair day and a suit that probably cost more than my first startup's entire initial budget. He had that patrician look that came from generations of inherited wealth and the absolute certainty that he was doing you a favor by acknowledging your existence. He nodded at me with the kind of polite condescension usually reserved for children who'd just shown you a drawing that was supposed to be a horse but looked more like a potato with legs. "Honest work," he said, his voice dripping with the kind of sympathy people use when they're trying very hard to be nice about something they find deeply unfortunate. "Not everyone can handle working with ovens. The heat must be intense." I could feel Clara's death grip on my arm tightening, her fingernails probably leaving permanent impressions through the hoodie. She was silently begging me to just nod, smile, and let it go. To be the bigger person. To not make this worse than it already was. But here's the thing about me. I've never been particularly good at letting things go, especially when the opportunity for clarification is just sitting there like a gift-wrapped present with my name on it. "I handle servers," I replied, keeping my voice casual and friendly, like we were discussing the weather or sports scores or literally anything other than the fact that this entire room had just collectively decided I was beneath them. Just the digital kind, you know? Cloud infrastructure, algorithm optimization, that sort of thing. The man blinked at me like I'd suddenly started speaking Klingon. His mouth opened slightly, then closed, then opened again like a fish that had just realized it was out of water and wasn't sure how that had happened. "Oh," he managed finally. "So you're in IT support? For the pizza chain?" "Something like that," I said, deciding that explaining the intricacies of logistics technology to someone who probably still had his secretary print out his emails was a losing battle. "I make sure the digital ovens talk to the digital delivery trucks." Very technical, very heat-intensive in the metaphorical sense. A few people chuckled nervously, unsure whether I was joking or just socially incompetent. Honestly, I was wondering the same thing. Clara shot me a look that could have frozen hell over. The look that clearly communicated smile right now or you're sleeping on the couch for the next calendar year, possibly longer. So I smiled. I smiled like my life depended on it, like I was auditioning for a toothpaste commercial, like I was the happiest pizza delivery IT support guy who'd ever walked into a room full of people who probably tipped their housekeepers more than they thought I made in a year. Malcolm, sensing that this introduction had gone about as well as the Titanic's maiden voyage, quickly started ushering everyone toward the table. Shall we sit? I took the liberty of pre-ordering some appetizers, and I'm sure everyone's eager to get started. As we made our way to our assigned seats, because of course there were assigned seats, complete with little name cards and calligraphy that probably cost $50 each, I caught sight of the menu sitting at each place setting. It was one of those menus that came in a leather folder, the kind that whispered, "You're about to spend so much money," with every page turn. I opened it and immediately spotted the most expensive item, a 48-ounce Wagyu tomahawk steak, dry-aged for 60 days, with a price tag that could have fed a family of 4 for a week at a normal restaurant. It came with some kind of truffle butter and artisanal sides that were probably just fancy words for potato. Clara leaned over and whispered urgently, "Please don't order anything crazy. My father is paying, and..." "The Wagyu tomahawk looks amazing," I announced loudly enough for Malcolm to hear from his seat at the head of the table. "I'll definitely be getting that. Medium rare, with all the fancy extras." Malcolm's eye twitched slightly, but he maintained his smile like a true professional. "Of course, Evan. Whatever you'd like." Out of spite. I was ordering the most expensive thing on the menu purely out of spite, and honestly, it felt great. This was going to be a long dinner, and I was going to enjoy every single passive-aggressive minute of it. Dinner began the way all gatherings of wealthy men inevitably begin, with the traditional sport of competitive humble bragging, which is basically like the Olympics except instead of medals you win the satisfaction of making everyone else at the table feel inadequate while pretending you're not even trying. It's an art form, really, and these guys had clearly been training their entire lives for this exact moment. The appetizers arrived first, tiny portions of food that looked like they'd been arranged by artists who'd studied geometry and feng shui, little towers of scallops and microgreens that probably took 3 people 45 minutes to plate. Each bite cost approximately $30, which I only knew because I'd mentally calculated it based on the prices I'd glimpsed on the menu before a waiter had whisked it away like it contained classified information. I popped an entire scallop tower into my mouth in one go, watching Malcolm's face twitch as I destroyed someone's culinary masterpiece with all the grace of a garbage disposal. The guy sitting to my left, I'd already forgotten his name, something generic like Brad or Chad or possibly Thad, launched the first volley in the bragging competition. He was probably in his early 50s, with that specific kind of tan that came from spending weekends on boats instead of beaches, and he wore a Rolex that caught the light every time he moved his wrist, which was suspiciously often. "Just got back from Monaco last week," he announced to the table at large, though nobody had asked. "Took the yacht out for a shakedown cruise after the refit. Had them redo the master suite. Went with Italian marble this time. Really elevates the whole space." The wife insisted on gold fixtures in the bathroom, and I've got to say, she was right. Really ties the room together. Everyone nodded appreciatively, making those little sounds of interest that people make when they're supposed to care, but absolutely don't. Another guy across the table, this one younger, probably mid-30s, with slicked back hair and the kind of aggressive confidence that screamed, "I definitely have opinions about cryptocurrency that nobody asked for," saw his opening and took it. "Marble's classic," he said, managing to make even a compliment sound like a subtle put-down. "We went with Onyx in our Hamptons place. Had to ship it in from Brazil, total nightmare with customs, but the end result is just..." He made a chef's kiss gesture that made me want to throw my expensive scallop at his head. Can't put a price on quality, you know? Except he absolutely could put a price on quality, and he definitely would if given half a chance. This was all part of the dance. Mention something expensive, pretend it was a hassle, imply that money was no object, wait for someone to one-up you, and repeat until everyone at the table had established their place in the pecking order of wealth and taste. I was tempted, so incredibly tempted, to jump in and mention that one time our servers crashed during a massive Pizza Hut promotion and we lost approximately $300 million in potential order volume before my team managed to get everything back online. I wanted to see their faces when they realized that my pizza job involved more money in a single afternoon than most of them saw in a year. I wanted to watch them try to reconcile their assumptions about delivery drivers with the reality that I'd once spent 72 hours straight debugging code that would eventually save our clients literally hundreds of millions in operational costs. But I didn't. Not yet. Because timing is everything, and I was saving my ammunition for when it would have maximum impact. Plus, Clara had her hand on my thigh under the table, squeezing it in a way that communicated both, "Please behave," and "I will absolutely murder you if you embarrass me," in equal measure. The conversation continued its predictable trajectory. Someone mentioned their kid getting into Harvard, legacy admission, naturally, though they didn't say that part out loud. Another guy talked about his art collection, specifically some painting by an artist whose name sounded like a sneeze, and whose work probably looked like a toddler had attacked a canvas with paint and rage. They discussed vacation homes in Aspen and investment properties in Manhattan and which private jet service they preferred, because apparently having opinions about commercial airlines was for peasants. I ate my overpriced appetizers and made appropriate noises, playing the part of the kid who got brought to the adult table at Thanksgiving and knew better than to speak unless spoken to. Clara was doing better than I expected. She'd slipped into her daughter of Malcolm Price persona, like putting on a comfortable jacket, making small talk and laughing at jokes that weren't funny, and generally being charming in that way that came naturally to people who'd grown up in this world. Then came the main courses, and with them, Malcolm's moment to shine. My Wagyu tomahawk arrived looking like something from a food magazine, all perfectly charred crust and pink center, accompanied by sides that had probably been deconstructed and reconstructed so many times they'd lost all sense of their original purpose. It was, objectively, beautiful. It was also the most expensive thing anyone at the table had ordered, which I knew Malcolm knew, which made every bite taste like victory. Malcolm waited until everyone had their food, until the table had settled into that comfortable rhythm of eating and drinking, until the moment was just right. Then he struck, and I had to hand it to him. The man had a sense of comedic timing that would have made stand-up comedians jealous. "So, Evan," he said, his voice carrying across the table with practiced ease, cutting through conversations like a hot knife through butter. Everyone turned to look at us, their forks pausing mid-bite, their attention suddenly laser-focused on whatever was about to happen. Malcolm had that smile on his face, the one that looked friendly but had teeth behind it. "I've been meaning to ask, at Domino's, do you actually drive the delivery scooter, or are you more of a back-of-house guy? Managing the toppings, making sure the pepperoni's evenly distributed, that sort of thing?" The table went silent except for the barely suppressed snickers. Someone tried to turn their laugh into a cough and failed spectacularly. I could feel every eye on me, waiting to see how the pizza boy would respond to being put in his place at the fancy dinner table. Clara's hand on my thigh went from squeezing to clawing. I glanced at her and saw something in her expression that hurt more than Malcolm's condescension. She was embarrassed. Not embarrassed for me, but embarrassed of me. She actually thought her father's question was reasonable, that maybe I should just laugh it off and accept my designated role as the family disappointment who somehow tricked his way into marrying above his station. But I'd had enough of being polite. I'd had enough of playing along. I'd had enough of watching these people congratulate themselves on being born into the right families and making the right connections, and never once questioning whether they'd actually earned any of their success or just inherited it like a genetic disease. I set down my fork carefully, took a sip of the wine that probably cost more per glass than most people spent on an entire bottle, and smiled at Malcolm with all the warmth of a shark that had just spotted a particularly stupid seal. "Neither, actually," I said, my voice calm and clear and perfectly pleasant. "I manage 138 distribution hubs across 12 countries. We handle the logistics algorithms that optimize delivery routes, reduce fuel costs, minimize carbon footprint, and improve delivery times for multiple Fortune 500 companies." "But you know, tomatoes." Malcolm blinked at me for a second, processing my response. Then he did something I wasn't expecting. He laughed. Not a polite chuckle or a courtesy laugh, but a full, genuine laugh like I'd just told the funniest joke he'd heard all year. Like I was a kid who just claimed he was an astronaut and Malcolm was the indulgent adult playing along with the fantasy. 138 hubs, he repeated, wiping at his eyes. "In 12 countries. Oh, Evan, that's..." He couldn't even finish the sentence. He was laughing so hard. And here's the thing that really, truly stung. The rest of the table joined in. Every single person sitting around that expensive table, eating their overpriced food and drinking their pretentious wine, laughed at me like I was the entertainment, like I was the dinner theater they hadn't even known they'd paid for. Brad Chad Thad with the yacht was chuckling into his whiskey. Crypto Bro was shaking his head like I was adorable and delusional. The women were exchanging glances that mixed pity with secondhand embarrassment. Even the waiter who was refilling water glasses had this tiny smile like he felt sorry for the delusional pizza guy who thought he was important. But the worst part, the absolute worst part that felt like a knife sliding between my ribs, was Clara, my wife, my partner, the person who was supposed to have my back in any situation. She laughed too. It wasn't a big laugh, wasn't even a long laugh. Just a small, nervous giggle that she tried to hide behind her wine glass. But I heard it, and she knew I heard it. And for a split second, our eyes met across the table, and I saw her realize what she'd just done, saw the regret flash across her face even as she tried to maintain her smile. I didn't say anything. I just picked up my fork, cut another piece of my spiced steak, and ate it while maintaining perfect eye contact with Malcolm. Inside, I was counting down the minutes until Karma showed up to this party, because I could feel it coming like a storm on the horizon. Karma was in the corner, stretching, warming up, getting ready to absolutely demolish everyone at this table. And I had the best seat in the house. We were about halfway through dinner, that awkward middle section where everyone's had enough wine to be loose, but not enough to be honest, where the initial posturing has died down, but the real conversations haven't started yet, when the universe decided it was showtime. I was working on my overpriced steak, which I have to admit was probably the best thing I'd eaten all year, when I noticed one of the waiters adjusting something near the corner of the room. The Monarch, being the kind of establishment that catered to people who needed to check their stock portfolios between courses, had a massive flat-screen TV mounted on the wall, usually playing whatever sports game was happening that evening with the sound muted. It was one of those concessions to modernity that old-money establishments made reluctantly, like admitting that maybe everyone didn't want to sit in complete silence while eating their gold leaf-garnished whatever. The waiter was fiddling with the remote, and suddenly the screen flickered from what looked like a basketball game to something else entirely. The Bloomberg Business Channel logo appeared in the corner of the screen, all sharp angles and professional graphics, and I felt my stomach do a weird little flip that had nothing to do with the amount of red meat I'd just consumed. Oh no, I thought. Oh no, 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 no. See, here's something I should probably mention. 3 days ago, I'd done an interview with Bloomberg. It was supposed to be a small thing, just a quick segment about emerging tech in the logistics space. Maybe 5 minutes of airtime that would get buried between discussions about cryptocurrency and whatever was happening with the Federal Reserve. My PR team had been bugging me about it for weeks, saying we needed to raise our profile, that being the mysterious tech genius was cute, but not great for attracting top-tier talent or securing the kind of partnerships that would take us from successful to legendary. I'd agreed to do it mostly to get them off my back, and also because the reporter had seemed genuinely interested in the technology rather than just wanting another fluff piece about a young CEO. I'd worn my favorite hoodie, the same one I was wearing right now, because that's what I wore when I worked, and I figured if they wanted authentic, they were going to get authentic. What I hadn't realized, what my PR team had somehow failed to mention in their infinite wisdom, was that Bloomberg was planning to make it a bigger deal than I'd anticipated. Something about a slow news day and a producer who thought logistics technology was surprisingly sexy as a story angle. The anchor appeared on screen, a polished woman with perfect hair and the kind of smile that made you trust her with your life savings. The closed captions were running along the bottom because the sound was still muted, but I could read the words clear as day. Up next, we meet the world's newest billion-dollar CEO, the man revolutionizing how America gets its pizza. Malcolm, who had been in the middle of telling some story about golf, because of course he was, stopped mid-sentence as several people at the table glanced toward the TV. It was just background noise to them, visual wallpaper to fill the silence, nothing important. Just another rich person getting interviewed about being rich, which was basically Bloomberg's entire programming schedule. Malcolm, you were saying about the 17th hole? Someone prompted, trying to pull the conversation back. But Malcolm wasn't listening anymore. He was staring at the TV with this confused expression, like he was seeing something that didn't quite make sense, but couldn't figure out why. A few other people had noticed now too, their conversations trailing off as their attention drifted toward the screen. The anchor continued, her lips moving silently while the caption spelled out my professional doom. Evan Miles, founder and CEO of SliceNet Systems, has achieved what many thought impossible, making pizza delivery profitable, scalable, and surprisingly high-tech. The camera cut to footage of me, sitting in what was very obviously my office. You could see my 17 monitors in the background, along with the whiteboard covered in algorithms and the empty Red Bull cans I'd forgotten to throw away before the interview. And there I was, wearing the exact same charcoal gray hoodie I was wearing right at this very moment, explaining something about route optimization and machine learning with the kind of enthusiasm that probably made me look like a complete nerd. I watched my TV self-gesture animatedly while talking, and I had to admit, from a purely objective standpoint, I looked exactly like the kind of person who would show up to a fancy dinner in a hoodie. The kind of person who cared more about the work than the appearance, more about the results than the resume. The kind of person who was, apparently, worth $1 billion and change. The room had gone completely silent now. Everyone was staring at the TV, then at me, then back at the TV, like they were watching a tennis match, but the ball was their understanding of reality, and it was getting volleyed back and forth at increasingly impossible speeds. Vera was the first casualty. She'd been holding her wine glass, probably her fourth or fifth of the evening, in that casual, elegant way that rich women do, like the glass was just an accessory to make her look more sophisticated. When the camera zoomed in on my face on the screen, showing me and my hoodie in all their high-definition glory, her fingers went slack. The wine glass slipped from her hand in slow motion, hitting the edge of her plate before tumbling onto the white tablecloth, spilling red wine everywhere like a crime scene at a very expensive wedding. Nobody moved to help her. Nobody even acknowledged it. They were all too busy staring at the screen as the anchor continued her piece, the closed captions scrolling along like the world's most passive-aggressive PowerPoint presentation. SliceNet Systems achieved a stunning $1.3 billion valuation this morning after announcing new partnerships with Domino's, FedEx, and Walmart. The company's proprietary algorithms have reduced delivery times by an average of 23% while cutting operational costs by nearly 40%. Malcolm's face had gone through several color changes, starting at his normal slightly tan complexion and progressing through pale, then gray, then settling on a shade that could best be described as man realizing he's been catastrophically wrong about something important. His mouth was hanging open slightly, which ruined his usual composed CEO demeanor and made him look like a very expensive fish that had just been told it was actually a bird. The camera cut back to the studio, where they'd put up graphics showing SliceNet's growth trajectory, our client list, which included some names that made even this room full of supposed business titans look small-time, and a breakdown of our technology stack that was probably way too technical for a general business audience, but looked impressive as hell with all its charts and numbers and upward trending arrows. Then came the kicker, the beautiful cherry on top of this schadenfreude Sunday. The anchor smiled at the camera and said, I could read it perfectly on the closed captions. Miles, who started SliceNet in his garage just 4 years ago, represents a new generation of tech entrepreneurs who are disrupting traditional industries from the inside out. When asked about his unusual approach to business casual, Miles told us, I'm not interested in looking like a CEO. I'm interested in being one. On screen, past me grinned and shrugged, and I remembered that moment during the interview. Remembered thinking it was a throwaway line that would probably get cut. Instead, it had apparently become my signature quote, the soundbite that summarized my entire philosophy. Present me cut another piece of steak and chewed it slowly, maintaining the most neutral expression I could manage while internally I was doing backflips. Clara had gone completely still beside me, her hand frozen halfway to her wine glass, her eyes wide enough that I could see white all around her irises. She turned to look at me in slow motion, and I watched her brain trying to process what was happening, trying to reconcile the guy she'd been embarrassed of 10 minutes ago with the guy currently being profiled on Bloomberg Business as one of the most successful tech entrepreneurs of the year. Oh my God, she whispered, and those 3 words contained entire novels worth of emotions: shock, disbelief, dawning realization, And if I wasn't mistaken, a healthy dose of, oh crap, I laughed at my billionaire husband. The TV cut to more footage, this time from some conference where I'd been on a panel, still wearing a hoodie. I had several. They were my uniform. Discussing the future of logistics with people from Amazon and UPS who were wearing suits and looking at me like I was either a genius or completely insane, possibly both. I swallowed my bite of steak and looked around the table, making eye contact with each person who'd laughed at me earlier. Brad Chad Thad with his yacht. Crypto Bro with his Onyx bathroom. The woman who'd been talking about her kids' Harvard legacy admission. Malcolm, who'd set this whole beautiful disaster in motion. And finally, I looked at the TV, where my face was freeze-framed next to the caption, Evan Miles, CEO, SliceNet Systems, valued at $1.3 billion. Wow, I said, breaking the silence that had fallen over the room like a weighted blanket made of awkwardness. That guy on TV has great fashion sense. Nobody laughed this time. Funny how that works. The silence lasted for about 3 seconds before the table erupted. Not an applause or congratulations, or any of those things you might expect when someone's success is revealed in spectacular fashion, but in pure, unfiltered confusion. It was the kind of confusion that comes from having your entire worldview challenged by a muted television and a guy in sneakers, the kind that makes people's brains short-circuit like a computer trying to run too many programs at once. Brad Chad Thad was the first to find his voice, though find might be generous considering what came out sounded like he was trying to speak, while simultaneously choking on his own assumptions. Wait, he stammered, pointing between me and the TV screen where my face was still frozen in all its hooded glory. You're that Evan Miles? The SliceNet guy? He gestured vaguely at the screen, at the caption that clearly said $1.3 billion valuation, like maybe if he pointed at it enough times it would change to something that made more sense to him. I took another bite of my steak, chewing slowly and deliberately, letting him marinate in his confusion for a moment before swallowing. Last I checked, I said, wiping my mouth with the cloth napkin that probably cost more than most people's dish towels. Though to be fair, I haven't looked in a mirror since we got here, so maybe I've been body snatched and nobody told me. But assuming I'm still me, then yeah, that's me. Wild coincidence, right? But you said, Crypto Bro was leaning forward now, his perfectly gelled hair somehow managing to stay in place despite the fact that his entire understanding of the evening had just been blown to pieces. You said you worked with servers and digital ovens, and I did say that. I confirmed, nodding agreeably. And it's all true. I do work with servers, just not the kind that bring you food. And I do deal with ovens, metaphorically speaking. Also pizza. Lots of pizza. I mean, not personally eating it, though I do enjoy a good pie, but facilitating the delivery of millions of pizzas annually through complex algorithmic optimization. I paused, pretending to think about it. But don't worry, I still know how to fold a pizza box. It's in the CEO handbook, right after the chapter on hostile takeovers and right before the section on hostile pizza toppings. The woman who'd been bragging about her art collection earlier, her name was Diane or Deanna or something that started with a D and ended with too much money and not enough self-awareness, was staring at me like I'd just revealed I was actually 3 raccoons in a hoodie. But Malcolm said you worked at Domino's, she said, and I could hear the desperation in her voice, like she was clinging to this one fact as proof that the universe still made sense. I do work with Domino's, I said patiently, like I was explaining basic math to someone who'd just discovered numbers. They're a client, a very large, very important client. We handle their route optimization, delivery tracking, predictive ordering algorithms. Basically, we're the reason your pizza shows up when the app says it will instead of 3 hours late and cold. I gestured at the TV, where they'd moved on to showing charts of our growth metrics. We also work with FedEx, Amazon, Walmart, DoorDash, and about 40 other companies that Malcolm probably has investments in. Small world, isn't it? Malcolm still hadn't said anything. He was sitting at the head of the table like a king who'd just realized his throne was actually an IKEA chair someone had painted gold, his face cycling through expressions like a slot machine that couldn't land on a winning combination. Shock, disbelief, embarrassment, anger, confusion, they all flashed across his features in rapid succession, and I had to give him credit for not just getting up and walking out. Then his phone buzzed. It was sitting on the table next to his plate, which was apparently fine for him but would have been rude if I'd done it. And the vibration was loud enough that several people jumped. He glanced down at it, and I watched his expression shift from confused to annoyed. He held up one finger in that universal gesture of "hold on, this is important," which was pretty rich considering he'd spent the entire evening making me feel like nothing I did could possibly be important. "Excuse me," he said, standing up with all the dignity of a man who absolutely did not want to take this call, but couldn't afford not to. "I need to take this. It's the university." He walked toward the corner of the room, pressing the phone to his ear, and I watched him transform from Malcolm Price, confident CEO, to Malcolm Price, confused person receiving unexpected information. His back was to us, but I could see his posture change, see the way his free hand came up to rub his forehead like he was trying to massage understanding directly into his brain. "Yes," he said, his voice carrying across the room despite his obvious attempt to be quiet. "Yes, this is Malcolm Price." "I what?" "No, I... Yes, I know who Evan Miles is." He's a pause. A very long pause. "He's my son-in-law, but I don't see what that has to." His voice changed. It went from confused to shocked to something I couldn't quite identify. Something between awe and horror, like he'd just been told that the guy he'd been condescending to all evening was actually the secret benefactor of something important. "A donation," he said, his voice going up half an octave. "From Evan Miles? To the entrepreneurship program? How much did you?" Another pause. This one even longer than the first. "I'm sorry, could you repeat that number? Because I thought you said..." His hand dropped from his forehead to brace against the wall, like he needed physical support to stay upright. $1.2 million. Right. Of course. That's incredibly generous. Oh yeah, I'd forgotten about that. Well, forgotten is a strong word. More like I'd done it 3 months ago, and then immediately moved on to the next thing, because that's what you do when you have enough money that million-dollar donations don't require a second mortgage in a fundraising campaign. My accountant had suggested it as a tax thing, but honestly, I'd done it because Columbia's entrepreneurship program had been instrumental in connecting me with early mentors when I was first starting out, and I believed in paying it forward. Also, it was Malcolm's alma mater, and the idea of anonymously donating to his favorite institution while he thought I was a pizza delivery guy had a certain poetic irony that I couldn't resist. Except apparently it wasn't anonymous anymore, because Malcolm was now having a very public conversation about my very private donation, and every single person at the table was listening with the kind of rapt attention usually reserved for celebrity gossip or details about someone's messy divorce. Malcolm ended the call and stood there for a moment, staring at his phone like it had personally betrayed him. Then he turned around, and I swear to God, the man looked like he'd aged 10 years in the span of a 3-minute phone call. He was pale, not just regular pale, but the kind of pale that makes you wonder if someone needs to sit down before they fall down. And there was a slight tremor in his hand as he made his way back to the table. He didn't sit down immediately. He just stood there behind his chair, gripping the back of it like it was the only thing keeping him tethered to reality, and looked at me with an expression I'd never seen on his face before. Genuine, unfiltered shock mixed with something that might have been respect, but could also have been indigestion from eating crow. Vera, who had mostly been silent since spilling her wine, which had created a red stain on the white tablecloth that looked like a map of her shattered assumptions, found her voice first. "Dad?" she said, her voice small and uncertain. "What was that about?" Malcolm cleared his throat, but it didn't help. His voice still came out rough, like he was speaking through gravel. "That was the development office at Columbia Business School," he said slowly, each word seeming to cost him something. "They were calling to inform me that my son-in-law has made a significant contribution to the entrepreneurship program." He paused, and I could see him struggling with whether to say the number, whether admitting it out loud would make it more real. A $1.2 million donation. The gasps around the table were audible, sharp little intakes of breath from people who were used to big numbers, but apparently not when those numbers were attached to the guy they'd been mocking for wearing a hoodie. "You donated $1 million?" Vera practically shrieked, her voice hitting a pitch that probably made dogs in the surrounding area very uncomfortable. "To Dad's school? You, the pizza guy? You donated?" She couldn't even finish the sentence, just gestured helplessly between me and Malcolm like the space between us contained answers she couldn't comprehend. I shrugged, cutting another piece of steak because this conversation was not going to stop me from enjoying my spite meal. Technically $1.2 million, I corrected, keeping my tone casual, like we were discussing the weather or the score of last night's game instead of an amount of money that could buy several houses in most parts of the country. I tipped well. Figured the entrepreneurship program could use some new equipment, maybe a few more scholarships. You know, help out the next generation of people who'll show up to fancy dinners in hoodies and confuse everyone. The silence that followed was absolutely delicious, even better than the Wagyu I was eating, and that was saying something. Malcolm stood there for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 30 seconds, still gripping the back of his chair like it was a life preserver, and he was drowning in an ocean of his own assumptions. I could practically see the gears turning in his head, watching him try to figure out how to salvage this situation, how to take back every condescending comment and dismissive look without actually admitting he'd been a complete ass for the past 4 years of knowing me. It was like watching someone try to unscramble an egg. Technically impossible, but fascinating to observe them try anyway. Finally, he cleared his throat again and released his death grip on the chair, standing up straight in a visible effort to reclaim some of his usual commanding presence. It didn't really work. He still looked like a man who'd just been told that the janitor he'd been ignoring was actually the building owner. But points for effort, I guess. I believe, he started, his voice carrying that practiced authority that probably worked great in boardrooms, but sounded hollow in a room full of people who'd just watched him get publicly humbled by Bloomberg in a phone call, that I owe my son-in-law an apology. Oh, this was going to be good. I set down my fork and gave him my full attention, because if Malcolm Price was about to apologize to me, I wanted to remember every single word for the rest of my natural life. This was the kind of moment you told your grandkids about, assuming Clara ever forgave me enough to give me grandkids. Malcolm took a breath, and I could see him wrestling with his ego, watching it fight back like a cornered animal. It appears, he continued, choosing his words carefully like he was navigating a minefield in expensive loafers, that I may have underestimated your professional accomplishments. When you said you worked with Domino's, I assumed, perhaps incorrectly, that you were in a more entry-level position. You thought I delivered pizzas. I supplied helpfully, because if we were doing this, we were doing it honestly. On a scooter, while managing toppings. You literally asked me about it 20 minutes ago. His jaw tightened, and I watched a muscle twitch near his eye. Yes. Well, it turns out, you're not just a pizza boy. He paused, clearly trying to find words that would make this less mortifying for him. You own the ovens. I couldn't help myself. I really couldn't. The setup was too perfect, the opportunity too golden, and I'd spent 4 years being the butt of this family's jokes. Actually, I said, leaning back in my chair with my wine glass in hand, I own the software that makes the ovens profitable. But close enough. You were in the same ballpark, just off by about $1 billion and several fundamental misunderstandings about what century we're living in. The laughter that rippled around the table was different this time. Awkward, nervous, like people weren't sure if they were allowed to find this funny or if laughing would somehow implicate them in Malcolm's colossal misjudgment. It was the kind of laughter you hear at a comedy show when the comedian makes a joke that hits a little too close to home, and everyone's uncomfortable, but also kind of relieved it's not about them. Clara was laughing too, though her laugh had this slightly manic edge to it, like she was processing about 17 different emotions simultaneously, and laughter was the only output her system could manage. Her smile was fixed in place, but her eyes had that wide, shell-shocked look of someone who'd just realized they were married to a completely different person than they thought. Like she'd been living with Clark Kent for 4 years and just watched him stop a bullet. Except instead of a bullet, it was her father's ego, and instead of super strength, it was a Bloomberg interview and a 7-figure donation. Vera had given up all pretense of composure and was just openly staring at me like I was a zoo exhibit she couldn't quite categorize. How did we not know? She asked, directing the question at Clara, but loud enough for the whole table to hear. How did we not know you were? She gestured at me, then at the TV, which had moved on to other news, but might as well have still been showing my face for how much it dominated the conversation. How did this never come up? It came up, Clara said quietly. and I could hear something in her voice that might have been regret or might have been defensiveness, possibly both. He told us. Multiple times. We didn't. She trailed off, because there was really no good way to finish that sentence that didn't end with, we didn't believe him because we're snobs who judge people based on their clothes and whether they went to the right schools. Malcolm, to his credit, was trying to recover some dignity from this situation. Well, he said, forcing a smile that looked like it physically hurt his face to produce. This certainly changes things. Evan, I hope you'll accept my apology for my misconceptions. And perhaps, he gestured to the empty chair next to him, the power position at the table. Perhaps we could discuss your business further? I'm sure there are synergies we could explore, given my connections in the... I'm good. Thanks, I interrupted, because I wasn't about to let him pivot this into a networking opportunity. Already got all the connections I need. Plus, I'm pretty comfortable where I am. I gestured to my seat, which was decidedly not the power position, sandwiched between Clara and some guy who hadn't said a word all evening. Views better from down here. I can see everyone's faces when they realize they've been idiots. That got a few genuine laughs, including one from Brad Chad Thad, who at least seemed to appreciate the absurdity of the situation even if he'd been part of the problem. Crypto Bro was still looking shell-shocked, probably recalculating whether his Onyx bathroom was still impressive or if I could buy his entire house with what I'd donated to Columbia in a single afternoon. We somehow made it through the rest of dinner, though the dynamic had shifted so dramatically it felt like we were in a completely different restaurant. Dessert arrived, some deconstructed chocolate thing that looked like a Jackson Pollock painting made of cocoa, and people picked at it while making awkward small talk that carefully avoided any topic related to pizza, delivery, or anyone's net worth. When we finally finished and started gathering our things to leave, that's when the real show began. The same men who'd been smirking at me 2 hours ago suddenly became very interested in my contact information. It was like watching vultures circle, except the vultures were wearing Armani and Rolex watches and probably had MBAs from schools that rejected normal people for fun. Brad Chad Thad, whose name I'd learned was actually Bradford, because of course it was, appeared at my elbow as I was helping Clara with her coat. Evan, he said, extending his hand with a warmth that definitely hadn't been there when he'd been talking about his yacht earlier. I have to say, what you've built is remarkable. Truly innovative work in a space that desperately needs disruption. This was the same guy who'd nodded sympathetically when Malcolm said I worked with ovens. The same guy who'd probably felt sorry for me earlier, like I was some charity case Clara had married out of misplaced pity. Now he was talking about disruption and innovation like we were old friends discussing our shared vision for the future. Thanks, I said, shaking his hand briefly before letting go. It's been a fun ride. Listen, he continued, reaching into his jacket and pulling out a business card that probably cost more to print than most people's business cards cost to design and print in bulk. I'm managing a venture fund that focuses on logistics and supply chain technology. We're always looking for promising investments, or even just opportunities to learn from leaders in the space. Maybe we could grab coffee sometime. Pick your brain about where you see the industry heading. I took the card, glanced at it. Sure enough, he was a managing partner at some fund with a name that sounded like it was generated by an algorithm designed to sound important, and slipped it into my hoodie pocket. Sure, I said noncommittally. Have your people call my people. We'll do lunch or brunch or whatever meal allows you to write it off as a business expense. He laughed like I'd said something clever instead of mildly insulting, which told me everything I needed to know about how dramatically the power dynamic had shifted. Money doesn't just talk. It changes the entire conversation, rewrites the rules, makes sarcasm sound like wisdom and casual dismissal look like playing hard to get. Crypto Bro was next, introducing himself properly as Hunter, because of course his name was Hunter. That algorithm you mentioned in the interview, he said, his eyes bright with the kind of enthusiasm that probably made his investors nervous. The one that uses machine learning to predict order volumes based on weather patterns and local events? That's genius. Pure genius. Have you thought about licensing that technology separately? I could see applications in about a dozen different industries. Haven't really thought about it. I lied, because we'd actually been in talks with 3 different companies about exactly that. But I'll keep it in mind. Here's my card, he said, practically shoving it at me. Seriously, if you ever want to discuss expansion strategies or fundraising, I know you probably don't need it after this valuation, but still, I'd love to be involved in whatever you're building next." The cards kept coming. Investment managers, hedge fund guys, someone who claimed to be a strategic advisor, which seemed like a fancy way of saying professional networker. Each one wanted a piece of whatever I was doing, wanted to get in early on the next big thing, wanted to be able to tell their friends they'd had coffee with the SliceNet guy before he became even more successful. One particularly bold gentleman, late 50s, silver fox type, wearing a watch that cost more than my car, actually said, "Maybe we could invest in your next venture? Get in on the ground floor of whatever you're cooking up." I couldn't resist. The setup was too perfect, the irony too delicious. "Sure," I said, giving him my best sincere smile. "Do you take payment in pepperoni? Because I've got connections with Domino's. Can probably get you a bulk discount." He laughed, but there was uncertainty in his eyes, like he couldn't quite tell if I was joking or if this was some weird tech bro thing he didn't understand. Which, honestly, made it even funnier. Clara was quiet through all of this, watching the parade of people who'd ignored me 2 hours ago now compete for my attention like I was giving out winning lottery tickets. When we finally made it to the door, she slipped her hand into mine and squeezed. I squeezed back, because despite everything, despite the awkwardness and the humiliation and the laughter that still stung, she was still my wife. And this was still the best dinner I'd had in years. The drive home started in the kind of silence that's so thick you could bottle it and sell it as a sound-dampening product. Clara sat in the passenger seat of my Audi, staring out the window like the passing streetlights contained the answers to questions she didn't know how to ask. Her hands were folded in her lap, still and controlled, which was never a good sign. When Clara went still like that, it meant she was processing, running through every conversation and interaction and assumption like a computer debugging its own code, and I wasn't entirely sure I wanted to know what errors she was finding. I focused on driving, navigating the late-night city traffic with the kind of careful attention that came from really not wanting to have a conversation yet. The restaurant had given us our car back with that efficient courtesy that came from knowing we could afford to tip well, and the valet, the same kid who'd looked at my Audi like it was a historical artifact earlier, had suddenly become very interested in whether I needed anything else, whether the car was running well, whether perhaps I needed my tires checked or my oil changed or maybe just a detailed cleaning service, because surely a man of my obvious success and importance deserved only the best automotive care. It was amazing how quickly pizza delivery guy had transformed into valued customer once the universe had outed me on live television. Almost like wealth was the only thing that mattered to people, and everything else, personality, character, actual human decency, was just window dressing. We made it about 6 blocks before Clara finally broke, and when I say broke, I mean that in the gentlest possible way, like a dam that's been holding back water for so long it finally just gives up and lets everything flow. Her head turned toward me, and I could feel her stare even though I was keeping my eyes on the road like my life depended on it. "Why didn't you tell me?" she whispered, and her voice was so small, so confused, that it actually made my chest hurt a little bit. Not the angry kind of hurt, but the sad kind, the kind that comes from realizing someone you love has been feeling lost and you didn't know how to help them find their way. I could have been a jerk about it. I could have gone nuclear, thrown back every pizza job, comment, and every time her family had dismissed me, every dinner where I'd been the punchline of jokes I wasn't supposed to understand. I could have made her feel as small as her father had tried to make me feel for the past 4 years. But here's the thing about being married to someone. You see them at their worst, and you get to choose whether you're going to kick them while they're down or help them up. And despite everything, despite the laughter at dinner, despite the years of her family treating me like I was lucky to have married into their world instead of the other way around, I loved Clara. Loved her in that complicated, frustrating, real way that meant I was going to choose helping over hurting, even when hurting would feel justified. "I did tell you," I said, keeping my voice calm and level, not accusatory, but not letting her off the hook either. We stopped at a red light, and I finally turned to look at her, really look at her. Her makeup was still perfect, her hair still flawless, but there was something vulnerable in her expression that I hadn't seen in a long time. Multiple times, "Clara, I told you about the company, about the contracts, about the valuations. I showed you the term sheets from investors. I explained what SliceNet does, how big we've gotten, what we're building. I know, but, she started, then stopped, because we both knew where that sentence was going and it wasn't anywhere good. But you didn't believe it. I finished for her. You heard logistics technology and Domino's partnership, and your brain just automatically translated that into pizza delivery, because that's what your family kept saying, and it was easier to go along with their version than to actually look at the evidence right in front of you. The light turned green, and I accelerated, maybe a little harder than necessary, the engine responding with that satisfying surge of power that came from German engineering and proper maintenance. Clara was quiet again, but this time it was different. Not the confused silence from before, but the contemplative kind, the kind where someone's actually thinking about what you said instead of just waiting for their turn to talk. Remember? I continued, because apparently I wasn't done yet, and 4 years of being called the pizza boy had given me plenty of material to work with. Remember Thanksgiving 2 years ago when your mom asked if I'd gotten a promotion yet, and I told her we'd just closed a $50 million funding round? And she patted my hand and said, "That's nice, dear. Maybe next year you can get promoted to manager." Or last Christmas when your Uncle Richard asked if I got free pizza, and I explained that we don't make pizza, we optimize delivery logistics for multiple Fortune 500 companies, and he laughed and said, "So you do get free pizza." Or literally any family dinner where I tried to explain what I actually do for a living and everyone just smiled and nodded like I was a kid explaining his imaginary friend. Clara's hands had gone from folded to fidgeting, her fingers twisting together in that nervous gesture that meant she knew I was right, but didn't want to admit it. "My family can be difficult," she said carefully, which was possibly the understatement of the century. "They have very traditional views about what constitutes success. Your family thinks success comes with a uniform," I said, turning onto our street. "Suits and ties and country club memberships, and the right schools and the right connections." They never stopped to consider that maybe, just maybe, the guy in the hoodie riding code at 3 in the morning was building something bigger than anything they'd ever accomplish. We pulled into our driveway, and I was about to put the car in park and call this conversation done when I noticed another car pulling up behind us. A very expensive, very familiar Mercedes that could only belong to one person in the world who would have the audacity to follow us home after that dinner. "You've got to be kidding me," I muttered, watching in the rearview mirror as Malcolm Price climbed out of his car, straightening his jacket like he was preparing for a business meeting instead of an impromptu driveway confrontation. "Your dad followed us home. That's not creepy at all." Clara turned around, and I heard her sharp intake of breath. "Oh God. What is he doing?" "Probably wants to discuss synergies," I said, putting the car in park but not turning off the engine yet. "Or offer me a mentorship opportunity. Or maybe just apologize again in private so fewer people can witness his humiliation." Malcolm approached my window, and I rolled it down with the kind of resignation usually reserved for being pulled over by a cop when you know you were speeding but were hoping they'd let it slide. He stood there in the glow of our driveway lights, looking significantly less composed than he had at the restaurant. His perfect CEO facade cracked just enough that I could see actual human emotion leaking through. "Evan," he said, and I had to give him credit. The man sounded genuinely embarrassed, which was probably a first in his professional life. "I'm sorry to follow you home like this. I wanted to speak with you, privately, away from everyone else." I glanced at Clara, who looked like she wanted to either disappear into her seat or jump out of the car and mediate, possibly both simultaneously. I turned back to Malcolm and gave him my full attention, because apparently this evening wasn't quite done humbling the Price family patriarch. "What's up, Malcolm?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. Not friendly, but not hostile either. "Just waiting." He ran a hand through his hair, which ruined his perfectly styled silver executive look and made him suddenly look older, more tired, more human. "I wanted to ask if perhaps I could visit your office sometime. See what you've built. Understand what you actually do instead of what I assumed you did." He paused, and I could see the effort it took him to say the next words. "I'd like to get to know my son-in-law properly. The real version, not the one I invented in my head because I was too proud to admit I didn't understand technology." It was a good apology, as apologies go. Honest, specific, acknowledging the actual problem instead of dancing around it. The old me, the me from 4 years ago who'd first met Malcolm and desperately wanted his approval, would have jumped at this offer, would have seen it as the validation I'd been craving. But the current me, the me who'd just spent an evening being mocked by people who should have known better, who'd watched his own wife laugh at him because her family's opinion mattered more than the truth, that me wasn't quite ready to make this easy. Of course, I said, giving him a smile that was probably a little too sharp to be genuinely friendly. You're welcome to visit any time. Fair warning though, you'll want to bring a helmet. There are forklifts everywhere. Also a lot of servers, and they're not the kind that bring you drinks. Might be confusing for someone from your generation. Malcolm laughed, but it was nervous and uncertain, like he couldn't tell if I was joking or being serious or maybe just being a little bit cruel in the way that people who've been hurt tend to be when given the opportunity. Right, he said. Helmets. I'll remember that. Great, I said, still not quite letting him off the hook. Have your assistant call my assistant. We'll set something up. Maybe do lunch. Or brunch. Whatever meal makes you feel most comfortable with the fact that your daughter married way up and you just didn't notice for 4 years. His face went through several expressions: shock, embarrassment, something that might have been respect or might have been indigestion from eating crow. I deserve that, he said quietly. Yeah, I agreed. You really did. He stood there for another moment, looking like he wanted to say something else, then apparently thought better of it and just nodded. Good night, Evan. Clara. He walked back to his Mercedes, and we watched him drive away in silence. When his taillights disappeared around the corner, Clara let out a breath she'd apparently been holding for the last 5 minutes. You didn't have to embarrass him, she said softly, but there wasn't much conviction in her voice. I finally turned off the engine and looked at her. I didn't embarrass him, Clara. Bloomberg did. Your father embarrassed himself by making assumptions and then doubling down on them instead of actually listening. I just didn't help him feel better about it. She was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. That's fair, she admitted. We sat there in our car in our driveway, and for the first time all evening, the silence between us felt less like a wall and more like a bridge, still shaky, still uncertain, but at least connecting us instead of dividing us. After Malcolm drove away and Clara headed inside to process everything with what I suspected would be an entire bottle of wine and several phone calls to her friends, I sat in my car in our driveway and realized something important. I did not want to go inside and continue having heavy conversations about feelings and family dynamics, and who said what when. What I wanted, what I desperately needed after an evening of being judged by people whose opinions shouldn't matter but somehow still stung, was to be around people who actually gave a damn about me for reasons that had nothing to do with my bank account or my last name or whether I wore the right clothes to the right restaurants. I pulled out my phone and checked the group chat, the one labeled SliceNet Degenerates, because we'd started it during a particularly brutal debugging session at 2 in the morning and nobody had bothered to change it to something more professional. Sure enough, my team was exactly where I'd hoped they'd be. Murphy's Bar, our unofficial office for when the actual office felt too official, celebrating the global rollout that had gone live this morning and had apparently been successful enough that Bloomberg decided to do a whole segment about it. There were approximately 47 messages in the chat, ranging from, "Where is our fearless leader?" to "Boss, if you're at a fancy dinner, you better be ordering the most expensive thing on the menu," to a gif of someone setting money on fire with the caption, "Malcolm Price discovering his son-in-law's net worth." My team had watched the broadcast. Of course they'd watched the broadcast. They probably had a viewing party complete with popcorn and a drinking game where they took a shot every time the anchor said revolutionary or disruptive. I texted back, "On my way. Someone better have a beer waiting for me." The responses were immediate and enthusiastic, exactly what I needed after an evening of polite conversation and passive aggression. Zeke, my CTO, and the first person I'd hired back when SliceNet was just me and a laptop and a dream that was probably 80% caffeine-induced delusion, sent back, "We've got a whole picture waiting. And approximately 1 million questions about why you wore that hoodie on TV." "It's my lucky hoodie," I typed back. "Also the only clean one." That was a lie. I had at least 4 clean hoodies, but it would make them laugh, and making my team laugh was worth more to me than making Malcolm Price respect me. I stuck my head inside the house long enough to tell Clara I was heading out for a bit, that the team was celebrating and I wanted to be there. She looked at me with those big eyes that were probably 90% wine at this point and nodded. "Go," she said. "Celebrate with people who actually appreciate you. You deserve it." It was possibly the nicest thing she'd said to me all evening, and I kissed her forehead before heading back out to my car. Murphy's Bar was exactly the kind of place that made fancy people uncomfortable, which was precisely why we loved it. It was a dive bar in the best possible sense. Dark wood, neon signs advertising beers that hadn't been trendy since the 80s, and a jukebox that played everything from classic rock to inexplicably hardcore country. The floor was perpetually sticky, the bathrooms required a certain level of bravery to enter, and the bartender. Murphy himself, a 60-something ex-Marine who'd seen some things and would occasionally tell you about them whether you asked or not, had a strict policy of not tolerating any bullshit from anyone, regardless of how much money they had. We'd been coming here since the early days, back when office space meant Zeke's apartment and company vehicle meant whoever's car wasn't currently broken down. Murphy had watched us grow from a handful of exhausted programmers to an actual company with actual revenue to a unicorn startup worth over $1 billion, and he'd treated us exactly the same the entire time, with gruff affection and a general assumption that we were all idiots who needed someone to occasionally tell us to eat real food instead of living on energy drinks and hubris. I walked in and was immediately hit with a wall of noise. My team had taken over the entire back section of the bar, which wasn't hard since it was a Tuesday night, and the only other customers were a couple of regulars who'd probably been sitting at the bar since the Clinton administration. Someone had connected their phone to the jukebox and was playing music that was way too loud and way too celebratory for a random weeknight, and I could see at least 3 laptops open on tables because apparently even when we were celebrating, we couldn't quite stop working. "Boss!" The shout came from Zeke, who was standing on a chair, an actual chair, like a crazy person, waving a beer in the air like he was conducting an orchestra. We saw the broadcast. You went full Batman reveal. The entire bar erupted in cheers, and suddenly I was being mobbed by my team. Approximately 25 of the smartest, weirdest, most dedicated people I'd ever had the privilege of working with. They were hugging me, slapping my back, shouting questions and congratulations and jokes about my hoodie all at the same time, creating a cacophony of affection that was the polar opposite of the polite, restrained atmosphere at the Monarch. This was my real family. These were the people who'd believed in me when SliceNet was just an idea and a pitch deck, who'd worked 80-hour weeks not because I forced them to, but because they genuinely cared about what we were building. These were the people who'd celebrated with me when we landed our first major client, who'd commiserated with me when servers crashed at the worst possible time, who'd stuck with me through the growing pains and the funding rounds and all the chaos that came with turning a startup into a real company. "You magnificent bastard," Zeke shouted, climbing down from his chair and pulling me into a hug that would have broken ribs if he'd been any stronger. Zeke was tall and skinny in that way that suggested he'd forgotten to eat for several consecutive days, with perpetually messy dark hair and glasses that he was constantly pushing up his nose. He was also possibly the most brilliant software architect I'd ever met, and I'd trust him with my life, my company, and my Netflix password. "Please tell me you wore that exact hoodie to whatever fancy dinner you just came from." "Obviously," I said, grabbing the beer someone had thrust into my hands and taking a long drink. It was cheap, cold, and tasted like victory. Couldn't let Bloomberg have all the fun. "How'd the rich people take it?" asked Maya, our head of operations, and the person who actually kept the company running while Zeke and I got distracted by shiny new technology. She was perched on a table, her bright purple hair almost glowing under the bar's dim lights, her expression gleeful in that way that meant she was imagining the chaos and wanted all the details. "About as well as you'd expect," I said, grinning. Lots of shocked faces, some wine spillage, and my father-in-law looked like he'd been hit by a truck made of his own assumptions. The team howled with laughter. They'd heard the stories. All of them knew about Malcolm and his constant dismissal of what I did, about the pizza job comments and the general Price family attitude that I'd somehow tricked Clara into marrying me instead of finding someone more suitable from their social circle. "Please tell me someone recorded it," said James, our youngest developer and the person most likely to accidentally break production on a Friday afternoon. He was 23, brilliant in that chaotic way that either resulted in genius or disaster with no middle ground, and he treated work problems like video game challenges. "Better," I said. "Bloomberg recorded it for me. It's probably already online." Someone pulled out their phone, and within 30 seconds we were all watching the segment again, except this time with live commentary from the team. They cheered when the anchor mentioned our valuation, laughed when my on-screen self talked about making pizza delivery surprisingly high-tech, and absolutely lost it when the segment showed our growth charts. "You're such a nerd," Maya said affectionately, watching me gesture enthusiastically on screen about algorithm optimization. "Look at you, getting excited about route efficiency like a kid talking about Christmas." "Route efficiency is exciting," I protested. "We reduced delivery times by 23%. That's huge." "And this," Zeke said, raising his beer high enough that Murphy glanced over from behind the bar with his standard expression of tolerant disapproval, "is why we follow this man into battle. Because he genuinely thinks logistics algorithms are exciting, and somehow, he makes the rest of us think so too." "To the pizza boy who out-delivered them all," someone shouted from the back of our group. "Cheers." Everyone roared, and we all drank, and for a moment everything was perfect. Just me and my team and cheap beer and the comfortable chaos of people who understood each other. We spent the next hour trading stories from the evening. I told them about Malcolm's face when he saw the broadcast, about Vera spilling her wine, about the parade of business cards from people who'd been mocking me an hour earlier. They told me about their viewing party, about the bets they'd made on how quickly I'd be recognized, about the toast they'd made in my honor before I'd even arrived. Somewhere around beer number 3, after we'd exhausted the topic of my evening and moved on to discussing the technical details of the global rollout with the kind of enthusiasm most people reserve for sports or celebrity gossip, I stood up on my chair, because apparently that was just what we were doing tonight, and got everyone's attention. "Hey," I said, and the chatter died down as 25 faces turned toward me with varying degrees of curiosity and inebriation. "I just want to say thank you for believing in this crazy idea, for putting up with my terrible management style, for making SliceNet into something actually worth $1 billion instead of just a PowerPoint presentation with delusions of grandeur." "Speech, speech," someone chanted, and others joined in until I held up my hands in surrender. "Fine. Speech." I took a breath, suddenly feeling more emotional than I'd expected. 4 years ago, this was just me and Zeke and a really stupid idea about making pizza delivery more efficient. Now we're partnered with some of the biggest companies in the world, we're profitable, we're valued at over $1 billion, and most importantly, I paused for effect, we're still having team meetings at Murphy's Bar because we're too stubborn to grow up properly. That got a laugh and a cheer from Murphy himself. "And because you're all amazing, and because we just successfully launched in 12 new countries without anything catching on fire or crashing spectacularly, and because I'm riding high on spite and expensive steak, I'm making an executive decision." I paused, letting the anticipation build. "Effective Monday, everyone's getting bonuses. Significant bonuses. The kind that makes you wonder if I accidentally added too many zeros." The eruption of cheers was loud enough that Murphy actually came over to tell us to keep it down, which only made us cheer louder. When I finally stumbled home around midnight, Clara was waiting with wine and a completely new expression, actual admiration. "I've been Googling you for 2 hours," she admitted, holding up her laptop. "Reading articles, watching interviews. I'm married to the guy from Bloomberg." "Congratulations," I said, collapsing onto the couch. "No refunds available." She laughed, a real one this time, not the nervous kind from dinner. "I'm sorry I called it a pizza job. I'm sorry I didn't believe you." "I'm sorry," I laughed. "Don't be," I replied, pulling her close. Without that joke, tonight would have been boring as hell. The next morning, my phone exploded. Investors, reporters, old college acquaintances suddenly remembering we were best friends. I ignored them all except one text from Zeke. "All systems stable. 0 errors. You're officially a legend, boss." I smiled, grabbed my coffee, and pulled on my favorite hoodie, the same one that had caused so much chaos. Malcolm could keep his suits and country clubs. I had my team, my company, and a wife who finally understood what I'd been building. Success, I decided, definitely tastes better with extra cheese.